now please join me in welcoming Carlos Run.
You can leave it on. It's up to you. Doesn't bother me. I like seeing some things in there. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm surprised. I mean, like, this is great to have such a large crowd, and it's exciting to have this display of solidarity, which I think is always so important for us, especially in a time like now. Especially, the evening before the election. Actually, I was just looking at my phone right now, and then we already started voting in Australia because we have voting in our embassy. So right now we're already in national elections, which is I don't know how to explain it sometimes to people, but we do get a lot excited. We voted. This is our 24th election in 19 years since the Bolivarian Revolution started. It's our 5th presidential election within that framework. It's the 2nd election that we have after President Chavez passed away. So this is really important for us and for the revolution and for the movement and what's going to happen. So I thank Claire for this wonderful presentation and seeing some of these projects that I myself haven't been able to go to. This is in Catilamar, no? In La Guaira and Vargas. By the way, which is a state that in 1999, when right after President Chavez was elected the first time, and on the day that we voted for the Constitution, because this current Constitution that we have was the first one that was voted for. We elected members for the first time to the Constituent Assembly, proposed many of the issues that were later reflected in the Constitution, and finally held a vote to approve it. It's the first Constitution that was actually voted for by the Venezuelan people. And the day that that vote took place, all this region of Vargas actually was flooded. I mean, there was a huge natural disaster. It rained in a month what should have rained in about a year. So all its hills and a lot of this, a lot of what the landscape just mudslides and just flooded, and there was a large amount of people that lost their lives during during those the disaster. And I mention that because now you see, to see how it has been rebuilt over the years that have passed, and how we were able to build other types of homes. I mean, a lot of those homes that gave in were homes that weren't really, industrially built. I mean, there were shacks that people themselves, built and made on their own. And now we have some, decent housing for that community. So it's important to bring that up. Look, I know many of you are familiar with a lot of issues in Venezuela, and there's a lot of details always. And sometimes, I get it's hard for me to keep track of what you know or may not know. So feel free to ask. If I lose you anywhere in the discussion. But what I think is important to know is the following. These elections are significant because we're having an election process that under the circumstances that we haven't faced before. We have faced before circumstances of economic hardships and other issues. We've been doing that since 2015 when the National Assembly was won by the Venezuelan opposition, and but these circumstances somehow have been aggravated in the last year due to the coercive measures that the United States has taken against Venezuela, and in particular since about August of last year. Just so you get an idea of how much impact it has had. We have been besides certain individuals being targeted, high officials being targeted in the government, which is important because you can imagine if the president of a country, if the vice president of a country, if the head of the Supreme Court, if the head of its electoral body is somehow sanctioned or somehow signaled out as somebody that's an outlaw, you can imagine how that has an impact on a country when you're trying to do business with that country, when you're trying to sign a treaty or sign a credits, all these things that how that could affect. Normally, the narrative here is that it's not something that affects the whole of the Venezuelan population, but you're only targeting certain individuals. But in reality, it does have a huge impact. We besides those individuals, we've been included. We were included in the travel ban under this administration. Some people think that part of that reason, the reason that we're included was so that it would no longer be referred to as a Muslim ban, because now you have a Christian, a predominantly Christian country included. We're not able to also reorganize our debt. So if we wanted to ask for new loans, if we wanted to trade our bonds with other countries, which is normal for countries to do in a way to extend or deal with economic difficulties, we're no longer able to do that because of the measures taken by the United States. We're no longer able to send back to Venezuela the profits made by Citgo. As you know, Citgo is it's an American company, but that's Venezuelan owned. It's owned by the Venezuelan Petroleum Corporation, PDVSA. And naturally what would happen is the profits made, dividends made, would go to Venezuela as part of the cash, so to speak, that we had to buy medicine, food, infrastructure, like all these things that normally need. We can no longer make use of that money in any way to the state of Venezuela. Another action that was taken by the U.S. government that nobody acknowledges or wants to talk about is that last year, FinCEN, which is a body within the Treasury that takes care of criminal networks and so forth, issued an advisory to banks saying that that you should be careful to process Venezuelan money because Venezuelan official money could be used for money laundering, could be the profits of corruption. If you have a company that's or a state company that is from one area making purchases from another unrelated area, you should look into that, and you should investigate and so forth. The results of that is that many banks, not only here in the United States but around the world, have decided not to process Venezuelan money, have decided to retain Venezuelan money. So if for example, we're going to make a purchase of, it's been something that we've had along the way, if we try to make purchase for food, for example, in Mexico, and the account won't make the payment. We have the money in the account, we won't have a bank to process it because the bank decides that because of this advisory or for whatever other reason, they don't want to touch Venezuelan official money because they could get in trouble or something, so they back off and they don't process it. So at the end of the day, we've had a lot of problems even getting something as natural as buying food, medicine, or any everyday supplies. One thing to think about in that context, if I mentioned the issue about the state company from one area making purchases outside of that area, because, see, a lot of these projects that we were talked about, for example, the housing projects, have been backed up by PDVSA. And because there was a change of concepts when President Chavez arrived to the government, PDVSA used to work as almost as an international, multinational company, oil company. It would send its profits back to the company itself, and rarely would you see some social investment from the company whatsoever. When President Chavez altered that logic the profits started being implemented in social projects. And that's why, and everything from housing, from medicine, for schools, all these things started to actually come directly from the profits and from made by the company. I mention that because imagine then if PDVSA, whose natural area is the oil sector, is making a purchase for, I don't know, cement, for building houses, then the banks are going to say, well, this area is not related to your area, so we're going to stop that payment. If PDVSA is buying food, it's not related to the area, we're going to stop the payment. And that's sort of what has been going on for the last couple of months, making, affecting the everyday lives of Venezuelan citizens deeply, through these measures. These are not measures that I think are not thought about before. I think there's an intent and purpose to doing this, because at the end of the day, there's a narrative being constructed that Venezuela is under some sort of humanitarian crisis, and I use that term because that's a specific term that is being laid out with regards to Venezuela. And the reason being that once you label a place as being affected by humanitarian crisis, then you can justify any type of international intervention. If you go through the legal definitions of what humanitarian crisis is, it's basically more or less saying, a place that has no access whatsoever to food, no access whatsoever to medicine, no access to basic necessities, and that's not the case. I mean, obviously, we recognize we've been undergoing a lot of economic problems during the last couple of years, primarily because we are largely dependent on oil revenues, and you've seen that the price of oil has gone down. Was actually picking up a little bit the last couple of months, but for the last couple of years, it was deeply going down, as well as other issues that we face. I mean, we have an opposition that controlled the distribution mechanisms in Venezuela, the food distribution controlled. I mean, a lot of the business, the imports, and that has led also to some sort of sabotage, internal sabotage, which has also aggravated the situation. Now, when you add to that the measures taken by the U.S., like that I mentioned before, then you definitely are going to have some sort of pressure on the population. What they're trying to sell to people in their narrative outside, in the mainstream media, is definitely gung-ho about promoting this, is that this is a humanitarian crisis that needs desperate intervention. One of the issues, for example, with the healthcare, for example, they've been saying, Venezuela is now spreading diseases to the rest of the region, and because it can't take care of it. Well, the malaria vaccine is only produced, to my understanding, is only produced in Colombia, in the region. So all the other countries buy from Colombia the components for the vaccine. We made a purchase for 2 million of these components, or these vaccines, and it's made up of 2 specific chemicals. We got the delivery of the first and never got the delivery of the second. So that when it was time to make the national campaigns or vaccinations or this, we didn't have the materials. Not because we don't have the money, not because it's a crisis, just because they wouldn't sell it to us. So I tell you this because that's sort of the context that we're facing right before this election. Now, politically, what the opposition has been doing, and by opposition I mean the more extreme right wing that has, for over 19 years not been able to really sell their political agenda to the Venezuelan people. What they're been trying to do is to not let these elections seem legitimate to the rest of the world. They've been campaigning outside of Venezuela. They've been coming here, lobbying in Congress. They've been lobbying in other countries in South America. They've been going to Europe as well, asking for sanctions on Venezuela, asking for all these measures. And they got the ear of the current administration here. So in 2017, by the end of 2017, we started a negotiation process with the opposition to see how we would move forward to these elections in a way that would be acceptable to them, in a way that it would maintain the peace that we were able to maintain after the Constituent Assembly ended the riots that you saw, or that we mentioned before, in earlier in the year. And throughout the negotiation, at the end, that took place during the end of 2017 and early 2018, we seemed to be getting somewhere. We had an agreement almost ready. All the points were down. There was differences on the exact date of the election, but pretty much everything had been agreed to. And the day before the signing, and everything was set up. There was a table with the pens and everything was ready for the signing. Then the opposition decided that they wouldn't do it, and they decided that coincided with a visit that Tillerson at the time did to the rest to various countries in the region. So we definitely saw that there was a connection between those two issues, and that what the attempt is to not have to make people think that because that group of the opposition, which is not the whole of the opposition, but it's the more extreme group that promoted the violence back in 2017, since they're not participating, they're trying to make it seem as if the elections are somehow illegitimate or that they're not to be, respected. That's despite the fact that there are opposition candidates participating. There's 3 other candidates that are going up for election tomorrow. Like I said, there's Henry Falcón, who represents part of the opposition, who's actually being supported by people that ran against President Chavez. Like his vice president was a candidate against President Chavez in '98. He even said that Capriles would be part of his cabinet if he were to win. So it's part of that opposition. You have another leader or candidate who's called Bertucci, who comes from a evangelical, more of a religious organization that's also trying now to reach power. So there is a very diverse election going on, but what the narrative that you'll see in the mainstream newspapers and CNN, or you'll see from State Department, is that there's questions over the legitimacy of these elections. We're nevertheless moving forward. Like I said, we started voting in Australia. We're going to move forward and vote in Venezuela, and where we have our embassies and consulates, despite what Canada tried to do. And I just saw a picture. They're starting to organize the tables in Canada, even though they were prohibited to do so, because they can't tell us what to do. But let me tell you, that's the way it worked. The Canadian government said that there was an official letter from the government saying that our request for elections, or for holding elections, which actually wasn't really a request. What we were saying was, we're holding elections on May 20th. We just want, security and make sure that, everything flows. And you have to let them know, obviously, because, if there's a line outside or whatever. And they decided to reply, well, we interpret your request, or your letter, as a request, which we are not going to process. So we're calling upon your government, your embassy, not to open and become electoral centers. So basically, Canada is telling us that we can't vote, even in our territory, because those consulates and those embassies are, by law, Venezuelan territory. So Venezuelans can't even go inside there and, and use their right to vote. This is very important, people, because, at the end of the day, this is, I don't know, I see in the history, you tend to attack countries for not holding elections, for not being free, but not because you are holding elections, And we already had people, measures of the, sanctions against some Venezuelan leaders because they were part of the campaign or part of the Constituent Assembly. So you're already criminalizing political participation and voting in that way. And now you want to block elections as well. Mike Pence went to the Organization of American States a few weeks ago and said, what's coming is that, we're not going to recognize those elections. I was told in the Department of State, we're asking you to stop those elections. Again, it's funny when I hear this talk about, Russian meddling in U.S. elections and how this is so absurd and ludicrous. However, if it's Venezuelan elections and it's to favor your candidate or, your political position, obviously you don't have a problem with that. So that's sort of where we stand. Look, this is part of a larger issue. And I think we also need to keep that in mind. At the end of the day, in Latin America, we have seen a series of changes in the last 3 or 4 years that have been very significant. It's a new wave of neoliberal policies trying to be implemented, workers' rights being abolished, constitutions being trampled upon, and many, not all perhaps, but many of these changes have been the product also of illegal maneuvers or maneuvers that were dressed as somehow legal. You have the coups in Honduras and the coups the coup in Paraguay, for example, were perhaps the first instances of using the judicial system to get or to justify getting rid of an elected official. But then you have something as bizarre as what took place in Brazil. I mean, where you had not only did they overthrow the president and left her vice president, who now has a popularity of 4%, which is like a margin of error. But now the government is attacking President Lula, or preventing him from running an election, which is something very bizarre. And I only mention this because you need to see this in the whole region's context. Okay, what they're trying to do in Venezuela is, they actually try to do this in Venezuela. As a matter of fact, after the National Assembly was taken over by, the opposition was fairly elected into the National Assembly. But after these neoliberals took the National Assembly, they've also tried to do the same thing to President Maduro. I mean, they illegally created a new Supreme Court who is not even present in Venezuela. They're actually doing, and they're signing decisions. And the other day I saw a letter from one of these judges with the decision that says, and then you see the letterhead, it says Venezuela, or Supreme Court of Venezuela, Coral Gables, Florida. It's kind of very interesting that they believe that they have that means anything. But again, no, it's important because what they're trying to do, and we laugh about it, but what they're trying to do really is set up something like a parallel government outside of Venezuela. And we've seen this take place in other places before. I mean, if we could discuss Syria, Libya, and other countries where sort of the same type of strategy has been set up in ways that, eventually you declare the government actually in place as a non-existent or not recognizable government, and then you start gathering the opposition and then recognizing them as the legitimate government, giving them the seat at the OAS, the UN. So this is some strategy that has been put to place in place in the past. So I say this because I honestly come today. I'm not really. Perhaps in another context, I'll be more concerned about the internal election, and I'm pretty confident because a lot of the you see that a lot of people in Venezuela, and I was there recently about a month ago, and I could feel that a lot of people, even from the opposition base, are very resentful of the opposition leaders that are outside asking for sanctions and sabotage against the government because they're experiencing the difficulties, and they say, well, why are these people not even here, first of all, and second of all, why are they asking for things to get worse? So that's definitely lost. They have definitely lost their support among many of their own base, and that probably will turn some of the opposition against coming out to vote. And there's also divisions. Like I said, there's two other opposition candidates. So there's divisions. I was joking a little bit earlier, but it's true. They're even having problems here to coordinate where they're going to protest because they can't get together and use a common strategy.
That's terrible.
But at the end of the day, and this is the thing. I'm not really concerned about how the internal election is going to take place, in the sense that what we see in the last couple of months has been people going out to the streets, supporting President Maduro in the campaign trail, and really being wanting to move forward, wanting to get the country out of this situation, wanting to work harder to make it more productive, to make it to guarantee that what we've been building for all these years, we can actually, we could move a step forward, strengthen popular power, strengthen community power. We're undergoing a constituent assembly process right now, which is something that also never gets covered in the news. It's a process of rewriting the Constitution, updating the Constitution that we had before, but also including new things. And one of the great things about this assembly is that for the first time it included sectors that hadn't been included before, and it specifically forced the structure of the assembly to include these sectors. And there's people that receive pensions for the first time are represented in a constitutional assembly and have their voice and their say in whatever gets drafted. People that represent rural workers, or even labor unions, or people that represent other persons with some sort of disabilities are represented in this Constitutional Assembly. This is part of of what's going on now. So under that spirit, we're moving forward, and that's why I'm pretty confident that we're moving forward in this particular election, and with the support people reflecting that by supporting President Maduro. But what I'm concerned about is what's going to happen the day after, because of the United States' position, because of the position of U.S. allies outside. And, they already said they're not recognizing these elections. They already said they want to bar Venezuelan government officials from their countries. They want to see, Venezuela suspended from the OAS, sort of going back to the same mistake they made with Cuba. And that's sort of the scenario we're having. We're unfortunately, it's sort of backtracking in history. And I know sometimes it seems that because we don't have, we haven't had open military interventions in Latin America in the last several years, it may seem as if this is something that's, we don't have to worry about anymore. But then when you see who's directing policy now, it's the same people that in 2002 were there to have President Chavez, that promoted the coup against President Chavez, that had supported the idea that he was taken out to an island and it was going to be taken outside of the country, even killed him. We never know actually what was going to go on there. But it's the same people that are here now, and they're coming into this administration with pretty much the same framework in mind. So I say this not to alarm, but to make people aware, because I think it's important for us, or for everyone, to be aware of what could happen in Venezuela, and that there's definitely an interest in overthrowing a popular government, because it's sort of like the piece you need to remove so that you could have a right-wing Latin America again. And also reconstruct the the FTAA and all this the projects that that somehow were stopped when the more progressive governments came into power. We don't know what's going to happen. I think it's important for people to be on the lookout. And all the displays of solidarity that you could have, obviously, are very significant to the Venezuelan people, because I think, you know, one of the most difficult part of my job probably is having to make a bridge between the people of Venezuela and the people of the United States. Because sometimes, because of this tension, maybe, you know, we tend to forget that, you know, the United States is not just its government, it's not just, you know, these aggressions against us, but it's a lot of people that are here, that are struggling, that have the same problems that we have, that have the same hopes that we have, and that's what we have to unite. So it's great that, you know, Claire was able to go there, and it's great that, you know, more people are get to go there, because those are the bridges that we need to build. Because we fight for the same things, we dream for the same things, and I think it's important also to always remember that when you display solidarity with Venezuela, Venezuela feels that it's not alone. Venezuela feels over there that, you know, that there's somebody to work with, there's somebody to build with in the United States, and Venezuela also displays the solidarity with the people of the U.S. So. I'll leave it here, but I guess we're going to have, it'd be great if we have some more exchanges and I could ask some of your questions.